From his earliest memories, the hierarchy of the household was simple. His sister Amanda received the finest gifts, the newest clothes, the warmest praise, while he was told that practicality suited him better. His parents repeated the phrase so often that it began to echo in his mind like a family proverb. He was the one who needed little, who should accept less, who could live without adornments. The message was wrapped in the tone of compliment, but it carried the sting of dismissal. Somewhere deep inside him, a quiet rebellion grew. He wanted to prove that what he desired mattered, that his dreams carried as much weight as anyone else's. At 22, when most of his friends were buying used sedans or financing modest new cars, he found himself drawn to something far less sensible. In a junkyard at the edge of town stood the skeleton of a 1969 Mustang fastback. Its red paint faded to the color of dried rust, its body pockmarked with dents, its tires long deflated. It was barely more than a shell, but to him, it glowed. Where others saw ruin, he saw possibility. He spent his entire savings on that corroded frame, dragging it home with the solemn pride of someone who had just rescued a relic of history. Neighbors shook their heads. They called it a heap, a foolish indulgence, a burden that would never run again. Even his relatives raised eyebrows at the sight of the wreck squatting in the driveway, a contrast to Amanda's gleaming compact car bought with parental money. He endured the laughter without reply. Every derisive glance only tightened his resolve. That car, even in pieces, was a symbol of escape from the arithmetic of favoritism that had defined his life. Nights in the garage became a ritual. He learned to disassemble rusted bolts with patience, to grind down corroded panels until sparks danced against the concrete floor. His hands grew scarred, the skin on his knuckles cracked, but he welcomed the pain as evidence of progress. When his friends went out drinking, he stayed behind, crouched under the chassis with a flashlight balanced precariously, memorizing the anatomy of a machine older than himself. He scraped together money from part-time jobs, every tip from late shifts saved in jars until he had enough for the next piece. A carburetor, a set of chrome trim, a replacement hood. The garage filled with the smell of oil and dust, with shelves lined by manuals covered in fingerprints. He studied diagrams until the lines blurred into his dreams, waking in the middle of the night with ideas about wiring or suspension. In winter, his breath hung in clouds while he worked, fingers numb but determined. In summer, sweat drenched his shirt as he sanded panels smooth, the metallic dust clinging to his skin like glitter from another world. Years passed in this rhythm of sacrifice. Vacations were skipped, clothes worn thin, meals kept simple. He measured time not in birthdays or holidays, but in milestones of the restoration. The day the engine finally turned over. The first time he heard the rough cough of ignition. The morning when the new paint glistened under sunlight. Slowly, the carcass transformed. The faded body regained its red sheen, deeper now, glowing like fire under clear coat. The wheels shone. The chrome caught reflections of the neighborhood that once mocked him. To him, the Mustang was never just a vehicle. It was proof carved in steel that patience and vision could reshape the world. Every hour spent hunched over the frame was an act of defiance against the label of practicality. He was not the sibling destined to take leftovers. He was the architect of his own dream, even if no one else recognized its worth. Standing in the driveway beside the car that had once been derelict, he often felt a surge of pride that no compliment from his parents could have matched. The car was alive again because he had willed it so. Its polished red bodywork carried the weight of every sacrifice, every blister, every lonely night spent in the dim garage. It became his identity, a mirror reflecting the part of himself that refused to be ignored. For him, the Mustang was not merely transportation. It was a declaration, a promise whispered to himself in the sound of the revving engine. It said that no matter how often he had been told to accept less, his ambitions deserved space on the road. And with every gleam of sunlight off the hood, with every vibration beneath his feet as the motor roared, he knew that he had built not just a car, but a sanctuary. It was the embodiment of freedom, and the red light of that dream burned brighter than the shadows of neglect that had haunted his childhood. Amanda had always lived as if the world owed her glamour. From her teenage years, she cultivated an image of opulence, surrounding herself with designer clothes, glittering jewelry, and friends who mirrored her appetite for extravagance. Her weekends were a blur of loud parties, champagne glasses, and expensive photographs carefully staged for admiration. She moved through life with the confidence of someone who believed the rules were written for others, not for her. When she announced her engagement to a banker whose family's wealth was matched only by their social connections, her parents reacted as if royalty had chosen them for an alliance. The engagement transformed the household into a theater of obsession. Every conversation revolved around plans for the ceremony. Catalogs of imported flowers arrived in stacks on the kitchen table, each glossy page filled with roses, bred in distant greenhouses, and orchids flown in from tropical climates. A wedding planner, renowned for orchestrating celebrity events, was hired at a fee that dwarfed the cost of most people's annual income. The venue chosen was not a modest church or community hall, but a sprawling estate outside the city, with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and a reputation for hosting senators and magnates. Costs spiraled with each decision. Live musicians were selected after countless auditions, their fees rising as ensembles grew in number and prestige. Sample menus came from a chef, whose name carried weight in culinary circles, every dish plated like art, every price tag steep enough to cause unease even in wealthy families. Gowns were tailored in boutiques that demanded months of waiting lists. Accessories were shipped overnight at inflated costs to avoid the horror of imperfection. The wedding, still months away, already consumed more money than some would spend on a house. For Amanda, it was all expected, a natural extension of her lifestyle. She moved from one fitting to another, from tasting session to decor rehearsal, as if born for the stage that awaited her. For their parents, it became a mission, a test of devotion. They whispered about how neighbors would marvel, how colleagues would envy, how the family name would be elevated. They had never shown such urgency for anything else. Their voices grew louder when discussing the budget, yet their resolve only hardened. No expense seemed too great for Amanda's vision of perfection. He watched the transformation with a growing sense of dread. The numbers did not lie, and even he, without direct access to their accounts, could see the strain. Bills arrived in thick envelopes, credit card balances stretched, and casual remarks about tight months slipped through their conversation. The once cautious household turned into a reckless engine, devouring resources for a single day of spectacle. Amanda's fiancé contributed, but it was clear the burden pressed heavily on their parents' shoulders. The tension reached a climax one evening when the mother, her voice heavy with both exhaustion and conviction, declared that families must sacrifice. She said Amanda deserved an ideal day, a flawless beginning to her marriage. The words struck him harder than any insult. Beneath the simple phrase lay an undeniable truth. His own years of effort, his dream car, the symbol of his independence, were now considered expendable. It was not simply about money, but about hierarchy, about the old arithmetic where Amanda's happiness outweighed his own. The realization was bitter. He had imagined that his Mustang, polished and resurrected through years of sacrifice, stood outside the reach of family dynamic. It was his achievement, built not with their approval, but in spite of their neglect. Yet in their eyes it was nothing more than an asset, a convenient reservoir of value waiting to be tapped. His treasure had become their safety net, his sanctuary reimagined as collateral for Amanda's golden stage. That knowledge sat in his chest like a weight. He could not shake the image of floral arches imported from Europe and chandeliers casting light on champagne fountains, all shimmering at the cost of his labor. The contrast was cruel. While he had bled on cold concrete floors restoring a forgotten machine, Amanda would glide down an aisle lined with petals worth more than his yearly earnings. His pride and sacrifice were invisible to them, erased beneath sequins and orchestras. In that moment, he understood with chilling clarity what his place in the family had always been. He was the reliable one, the practical one, the silent source of stability. Amanda was the spectacle, the chosen heir to their adoration. And now, as wedding fever consumed them, that imbalance threatened to strip him of the very dream that had kept him going. The day before the rehearsal dinner dawned like any other, heavy with summer heat and the sound of cicadas. He returned home with the casual expectation of finding comfort in the familiar sight of his Mustang, gleaming under the garage light like a trophy born of sweat and endurance. As he pulled into the driveway, a strange unease prickled across his skin. The garage door was ajar, its shadow yawning wider than usual. He stepped out slowly, his heart already quickening, though his mind had not yet grasped why. When he looked inside, the space seemed cavernous, stripped of its anchor. The bright red body that had once dominated the room was gone, leaving only an outline of dust on the floor where the tires had rested. For years, the car had been a beacon of his determination, occupying that spot like a monument. Now it was only emptiness, the silence thick enough to feel. Tools remained scattered, rags stained with oil still draped across the workbench, but the centerpiece of it all had vanished. On the wooden bench, among sockets and wrenches, lay a folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he reached for it, though some part of him already dreaded the words it contained. The handwriting was unmistakably his mother's, precise and deliberate, as if care could soften the cruelty. The message was brief, almost casual. They would return the money when they could, and he should not ruin Amanda's celebration. Each word pierced deeper than the last, reducing half a decade of sacrifice to an afterthought in the theater of a wedding. He stood frozen, unable to move, as though the concrete floor beneath him had liquefied. The memory of every long night flooded back in an instant. The sting of scraped knuckles, the hours bent over manuals by the dim light of a single bulb, the satisfaction of hearing the engine roar back to life. All of it had been taken without permission, converted into currency for someone else's dream. He had believed that what he built with his own hands was untouchable, yet it had been sold away with the stroke of a pen. In that moment, he felt both hollow and burning. The garage that once held the sound of clattering tools and the metallic heartbeat of a resurrected engine now echoed only with betrayal. The note might as well have been written in ash, because it left nothing behind but ruin. He wanted to shout, to smash the bench, to tear the paper into shreds, but his body betrayed him with stillness. He simply stared at the void, trying to reconcile the impossible reality with the years of devotion that had occupied that very space. The following evening confirmed the cruelty. At the wedding rehearsal, relatives mingled beneath strings of lights, their voices filled with admiration for the spectacle. They marveled at the imported flowers and the glittering decorations, at the champagne that cascaded in fountains and the promise of fireworks planned for the main event. To them, the celebration was a triumph, a dazzling display of love and prosperity. To him, it was the cost of everything he had built. His father's hand landed heavily on his shoulder. The gesture meant as encouragement, but felt more like an insult. His father told him to be proud, to recognize that his sacrifice had elevated the day into something unforgettable. Pride, however, was absent. Only bitterness settled in his chest as he watched Amanda bask in attention, radiant in her designer gown, oblivious to what had been stripped from him. She never glanced his way, never acknowledged the weight he bore. To her, his loss was invisible, perhaps even irrelevant. Standing among the applause and laughter, he felt like an intruder in his own family. The car had been his lifeline, his testament against years of neglect, and now it had been erased as easily as a stain wiped from glass. The guests clinked glasses in celebration, unaware that the glitter of their evening was paid for with his years of labor. The music swelled, the lights shimmered, and no one saw the silent collapse inside him. The garage, now empty, lingered in his mind as a symbol of betrayal. It was no longer a place of creation, but of theft. Every time he pictured the vacant spot on the concrete, he felt the sting anew. He had been robbed not just of metal and paint, but of identity, of proof that he could build something enduring. What remained was silence, sharper than any accusation. The anger did not flare and burn out. It cooled into something precise and usable, a blade forged under pressure. He sat at his desk with the laptop open, the garage ledger spread beside him, and began to turn 5 years of effort into numbers that no one could wave away. The process started with a clean spreadsheet and a title that read like a verdict. He entered the acquisition cost of the Mustang's corroded shell, then lined up every receipt he had saved in a shoebox labeled for someday. Someday arrived as he scanned each slip into neat digital folders and keyed figures into cells that clicked forward with clinical inevitability. He separated the columns by categories that reflected the hidden architecture of restoration: powertrain, body and paint, interior, suspension and brakes, electrical, consumables, and shop supplies. Under powertrain, he entered the rebuilt small block, the refurbished carburetor, the timing set, the water pump, belts, and hoses. For the body, he itemized sheet metal panels, rust treatment chemicals, primer, sanding discs, and the professional respray that had transformed oxidized red into a deep, glassy finish. The interior line grew with seat foam, upholstery kits, headliner, carpeting, and the dye that returned faded plastics to a dignified sheen. Suspension and brakes took their place with shocks, bushings, tie rods, rotors, calipers, and lines. Electrical followed with a new harness, alternator, battery, starter, bulbs, and fuses. The consumables column told a quieter truth: epoxy, seam sealer, masking tape, tack cloths, solvents, rags, and the bottled gas that fed 1,000 spot welds. He added a second sheet for labor, assigning hours to tasks he had tracked in a grease-stained notebook. He priced his time at the state minimum wage, a concession to fairness that still startled him when the total climbed. Engine removal and installation, body panel alignment, block sanding that had eaten entire weekends, wiring harness routing through cramped firewalls, brake bleeding, final assembly and test. Each line had a start date, an end date, and a duration that lived both in the cells and in the soreness he remembered in his hands. He did not inflate the hours. He rounded down when unsure. The authority of restraint would matter later. Comparable sales formed a third sheet. He pulled market data from auction results and classifieds archived in his email, listing prices for similar 69 fastbacks with similar build quality and equipment. He attached links, captured screenshots, and noted condition adjustments to avoid the appearance of wishful thinking. Where a comparable had a higher spec engine or rare factory options, he adjusted downward. Where his car had newly rebuilt systems that others lacked, he annotated without claiming premiums that would look opportunistic. The valuation line he settled on was conservative by design. He wanted his figures to stand even under hostile scrutiny. Insurance premiums and registration fees filled the final sheet, along with storage costs he had paid during the repaint period. He included utilities for the months when his garage lights had burned late into the night, not as a dramatic flourish, but as a reminder that electricity and heat had sustained the work when breath fogged in winter air. With everything in place, he linked sheets into a summary that rolled upward into a single number. The total stared back at him with a gravity that felt both vindicating and sobering. It hovered just under $47,000, a sum that did not capture pride or memory, only materials, time, and market reality. He printed the packet and assembled it into a binder with tabs that turned easily. Overview, timeline, parts and materials, labor, valuation, proof of ownership, disposition. The timeline established key dates from purchase to completion, documented with photographs of the chassis rising from ruin, then polished into reflection. The proof section included the title in his name, VIN photographs, purchase invoice, and before and after images dated by metadata. The disposition tab contained a single sheet that recorded the day the car vanished and the note found on the bench. The absence of a transfer authorization or bill of sale bearing his signature occupied its own page, a blank framed like evidence. He delivered the binder without performance. He placed it on a table in a neutral room and slid it forward, then stepped back to let silence do what words could not. Amanda leafed through the tabs with a growing stiffness in her shoulders that shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to something more volatile. The pages recited a story without commentary. They recorded what had been spent, what had been built, and what had been taken. She set the binder down and searched for a foothold that numbers refused to provide. The reaction moved through predictable stages: dismissal, minimization, indignation. But the cells did not blink. The total remained. Her husband arrived with the habitual composure of someone who lived among spreadsheets and quarterly statements. He opened the binder at overview, skimmed, then turned to labor and valuation. His eyes marked the footnotes, the sources, the conservatism of assumptions. He understood what the structure implied. He closed the cover more carefully than he had opened it, then shifted his attention to the printed demand that lay beneath: an itemized statement of loss, an account of unjust enrichment, a proposed repayment schedule, and a date by which acknowledgement was requested. He followed the meeting with a letter drafted in neutral language and sent by email and certified mail on the same day. The subject line identified the purpose with restraint. The body referenced the binder, attached the spreadsheet as a PDF, and summarized the figure to the dollar. It proposed a monthly repayment plan and indexed it to the federal judgment interest rate from the date of loss, not as punishment, but to preserve present value. It asked for confirmation of receipt and intent to cure. It noted that the family's decision had resulted in conversion of property and enrichment at his expense. It did not threaten. It documented. He addressed the message to his sister, copied her husband, and archived the send. Then he printed a clean copy for his records and slipped it behind the disposition tab. He created a tracking sheet for deadlines and responses, set calendar reminders, and opened a new bank account dedicated to repayment receipts. In a separate folder, he gathered evidence of assets that could satisfy the obligation if cooperation faltered: public social media posts that displayed purchases inconsistent with claimed inability to pay, property records indicating the couple's joint tenancy, a snapshot of a wedding registry that had been fulfilled well beyond necessity. He anticipated the rebuttals and recorded his counters before they arrived. When a protest accused him of assigning value to his own labor, he noted the prevailing shop rates that would have applied had the work been outsourced, leaving his calculation at minimum wage as a concession. When a suggestion arose that family matters should not be reduced to invoices, he documented prior financial transactions in which family obligations had been formalized when it benefited others. When pressure urged silence for the sake of harmony, he wrote a line in his journal that he did not send. Harmony built on erasure was not peace, but anesthesia. Numbers did what outrage could not. They reclaimed ground without raised voices. They turned a theft dressed as sacrifice into a debt defined by rows and columns. The precision steadied him. The binder existed now, independent of moods and allegiances, an artifact that could be read by anyone who understood arithmetic. The clock began with the postmark, and the first reminder was scheduled with a gentle buffer that reflected fairness rather than aggression. He closed the laptop, slid the binder into a drawer, and felt the faint click of control returning to its track. The world had taken what his hands built. His mind would measure the loss and collect it, one cell at a time. The months that followed were slow, grinding, and suffocating for them. What had once been effortless indulgence for Amanda became a series of humiliating compromises. She, who had always paraded through boutiques without glancing at price tags, now paused in front of store windows, her reflection tense, her hand gripping her purse as if it might slip away. Vacations were postponed indefinitely, dinner reservations canceled, and the air of extravagance she had cultivated began to collapse under the pressure of obligation. Each week the reminders arrived with the same steady rhythm. Every letter was polite, carefully worded, but sharp as steel. There was no room for excuses, no space for sentimentality. If Amanda delayed a payment or attempted to sidestep responsibility, her phone would vibrate with a notification. Another formal statement of arrears. Another reminder that the debt was not vanishing, that it was being monitored. He tracked her every move with meticulous accuracy. Receipts, invoices, and bank transfers became evidence in a case that would never close until the final dollar was accounted for. At first, she tried to laugh it off, dismissing the calculations as exaggerated. But each time she challenged a figure, the supporting documentation surfaced instantly: contracts, receipts, even photographs of the restoration process. There was no escape, only the steady march of accountability pressing down like a weight she could not shrug off. Her laughter gave way to irritation to desperation. Soon her eyes carried the constant glaze of exhaustion, her steps slower as if the very air clung to her. Her husband attempted to shield her, but he too found himself ensnared. The ledger bore his name as well, a reminder that marriage meant shared responsibility. He recognized quickly that this was not a battle he could win with charm or dismissive remarks. The financial evidence was impenetrable, each figure justified, each hour of labor documented. He began to age in visible increments, his polished demeanor cracking as he realized the scale of what they owed. Parents intervened with their well-rehearsed refrain: family should not reduce each other to numbers. Family should forgive. Family should share burdens. But their words rang hollow. Family had ceased to be a sanctuary the day the garage was emptied. His silence in response to their pleas was colder than anger. He no longer raised his voice. He no longer explained. The emptiness of that garage had drained him of any trace of patience. Their appeals slid off him like rain on glass, leaving no mark. Amanda's lifestyle transformed into a parody of itself. She clipped coupons in secrecy, her manicured nails trembling as she cut the paper. At restaurants, she ordered water and claimed she wasn't hungry. Designer handbags disappeared from her closet one by one, sold quietly, their absence concealed beneath claims of seasonal cleaning. She tried to hide these sacrifices behind forced smiles, but everyone noticed the dimming sparkle, the sharp edges of stress etched onto her face. Every confrontation ended the same way, with numbers. No matter her protests, no matter her tears, the sum remained fixed, the documents undeniable. It was a fortress she could not storm, a wall she could not climb. The marriage, once gilded with luxury, became a crucible. Whispered arguments leaked through closed doors, accusations twisted into pleas, and silence stretched long into the night. Eventually, her husband's composure cracked. He sat at his desk late one evening, staring at the balance sheet that seemed to grow heavier with each passing week. The silence of the house pressed in on him until the pen in his hand trembled. With a single signature, he released them from the charade. A check was written, the amount matching to the cent, the ink sealing their admission of defeat. When the envelope arrived on his desk, he did not celebrate. He did not gloat. He merely placed it among the other records, one final entry in the meticulous archive of betrayal and repayment. For Amanda and her husband, the ordeal was not just financial, it was reputational. Their once dazzling image of effortless wealth had fractured. Whispers followed them into social circles, questions left unanswered. The price of indulgence had become the story of their downfall. His name, once ignored in their gatherings, now lingered in every corner of their memory as a reminder of the cost they carried. The weight of repayment was not merely dollars. It was a shadow cast across their lives, an unrelenting proof that what had been stolen could never be returned without consequence. He chose the car in silence. The listings had been open for days, but he waited until the funds settled, and the final receipt in his binder matched the number in his account. The search became deliberate rather than hungry. He was not trying to replace what had been taken. He was choosing what came next. When he saw the fastback, a deep black that absorbed light rather than reflected it, chrome bright as new coin, he felt the decision land with the certainty of a torque wrench reaching spec. The seller's photographs showed straight gaps, clean welds, and a drivetrain restored with care rather than shortcuts. The car's stance was modest, its promise mechanical rather than theatrical. He booked the inspection, reviewed compression numbers and fluid samples, and signed for it without ceremony. The first start was a private ritual. He sat, adjusted the mirrors with measured movements, and watched the gauges bloom to life. The engine turned, caught, and settled into a steady idle that trembled through the seat in a low, disciplined rhythm. The sound was different from his red car, less raw, more composed, like a voice that had learned restraint without losing power. He let it warm to operating temperature, checked for leaks in habitual places, and took the throttle up in gentle increments, listening for misfires that never came. When he closed the hood, the latch engaged with a clean click that felt like a hinge closing on an old chapter. The drive home traced roads he knew by muscle memory. The black hood stretched ahead like a strip of polished obsidian, the reflections along its crown warping and straightening as streetlights passed overhead. The shifter moved through its gates with a firm, notchy confidence. The steering, tightened by upgraded bushings, asked for small inputs and gave back precise answers. He noticed details no one else would. The way the pedal box transmitted a faint hum through the sole of his shoe. The subtle rise in oil pressure under load. The clean handoff from mechanical fan to airflow at speed. The car was alive in a way that had nothing to do with nostalgia. It was a machine executing its purpose. Back in the garage, he arranged space differently than before. The new car did not sit on an altar of restoration parts. It stood at the center of a clean floor, with only the tools necessary for maintenance hanging within reach. The shelves that once held paint cans and sheet metal now contained torque charts, fluids, and a modest set of spares. He kept the binder in a locked drawer rather than on the bench. The empty spot where the red car had once rested was gone. In its place stood a black shape that did not ask to be defended. This was not a monument to patience anymore. It was a boundary made of steel. He handled the paperwork with the same care he had used in the ledger. Title transfer, registration, insurance endorsements, photographs of VIN stamps filed with timestamps, a maintenance log begun on day 1. He scheduled the first service interval, calibrated tire pressures with a cold gauge, and marked a discrete paint chip for later correction, though no one else would have noticed it. Each act said the same thing in different forms. Ownership was not merely possession. It was stewardship, and he intended to exercise it without apology. When he finally drove past his parents' house, it was not a pilgrimage. It was a line on the map between two destinations that belonged to him. He slowed only because the speed limit required it. Through the front window, he saw a flicker of movement, the unmistakable pause of recognition. Regret lived there, mixed with something older and more complicated, but it no longer reached him. The sound of the engine filled the cabin with a steady confidence, and the car's shadow slid across their lawn without hesitation. He did not stop. He did not circle the block. The moment passed behind him, and became smaller with each intersection. Freedom announced itself not as triumph, but as quiet. He noticed it in ordinary errands that no longer carried the weight of performance, in weekend drives that needed no destination, in the absence of defensive rehearsals for conversations that would not be had. The car did not fix the past. It made the future legible. He could feel it in the simple geometry of motion, throttle, horizon, breath. The anger that had once pressed hard against his ribs had cooled into clarity. The world still contained unfairness, but it also contained roads that led elsewhere. Over the next weeks, he learned the car's moods the way he had once learned the red one's anatomy. He discovered the precise RPM where the engine smoothed into a velvet sweep, the exact brake pressure that set the nose without unsettling the rear, the cornering line that used the suspension rather than fought it. He watched the paint drink morning light and release it in the evening. He kept the chrome free of fingerprints and the glass free of haze. Nothing was ornamental. Everything was intentional. The car became a sentence he could finish without raising his voice. When people asked about it, he answered with facts rather than stories. There was nothing to prove anymore. The ledger existed, the check had cleared, the binder was closed. What remained was motion. He took long routes for the sake of them, drove early when the city was still yawning, parked far from other cars without feeling defensive. The Mustang became a habit of self-respect rather than a shield. He no longer measured miles against loss. He measured them against presence. On a cold evening, he rolled the car into the garage, shut it down, and listened to the ticking of heat fading through metal. The sound was familiar, but its meaning had changed. It no longer sounded like effort cooling after battle. It sounded like a heartbeat returning to rest. He turned off the light and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the black curve of the fender dissolving into darkness. His life would not be organized around repayment schedules or apologies that never arrived. It would be organized around choices, maintained as carefully as torque and timing. He had bought a car, but he had also bought a boundary. The betrayal that once threatened to define him had become fuel burned clean, transformed into forward motion. Each mile reminded him not of what had been taken, but of what could no longer be taken. He had built something that could not be sold out from under him again, not because it was bolted to the floor, but because he had finally bolted himself to his own life. And as the garage settled into silence, he knew the truth that mattered most. The road ahead belonged to him.